Next slide. Similarly, we see some real improvements in care of severe surgical wounds. For example, early in the Revolutionary War in the 1700s, almost half of the wounded patients died. On the other hand, today, in the Iraq-Afghan war, of the severely and probably even more severely wounded patients, only 10% dies. So that shows that there are some medical progresses going on. Next slide. It's interesting to note that during World War I, about 10 million people died in the war. But after the war, there were 50 million documented and 100 million not well documented patients died of the Spanish flu. 10 times the number who died in the war. About a little over 500,000 people died in the United States. And in some Inuit villages, 85% of the village was eliminated by this disease. Recently, some cadavers, which were buried and frozen in Inuit villages in Alaska, were unearthed, and the virus was recovered. So we now have the original virus, which did all of that, and there are a great many studies going on with this virus right now. Next slide. Now, we report flu viruses by two antigens which sit on the surface of the virus, the H1, the H and the N viruses. Now the fact remains that in addition to these viruses, to these antigens which are generally typed, there are dozens of other antigens. So that when we say that the Spanish flu was H1N1, we say this was a terrible disease. But for example, in 1977, there was a flu epidemic in Russia. These viruses were also H1N1, but it was a genetically altered, very mild disease of which very few people died. So to say something about H1 and N1 is fine, but it doesn't completely describe all the characteristics of the virus. There are many other antigens, many other genes involved which determine the aggressive nature of the disease. And one of the problems with flu viruses is that they are enormously mutagenic. They change very rapidly. And from passing from one patient to the other, there are usually several mutations involved, and a relatively mild disease can turn into a very aggressive disease. Of course, it can also go the other way, that an aggressive disease can mutate and become a mild disease. And so it's very difficult to predict what's going on. But certainly, we need better facilities which we are able to respond more rapidly, and we should be able to immunize all of our populations rather than only selected groups as it's going on today. Next slide. We'll skip that. Next slide. Now, the problem with viruses in general is that we have excellent defense against viruses. We have antibodies, we have T cells which attack infected cells. Yet, still, viruses can be devastating and can kill people. Well, if we have all these defenses, how come they are still killing us? And the reason for that is that viruses have mechanisms whereby they defend themselves against our defense. So we have defense against the viruses, but the viruses have defense against us. My laboratory has studied these mechanisms, how viruses can offset our defenses. And for example, we have found that both viruses and cancer cells, as a matter of fact, can induce the fact that the receptors which take in interferons, which are one of the major defense mechanisms, can be detached by the action of the viruses or the cancer cells, and we suddenly find that cellular receptors, particularly the alpha-beta type receptor, start circulating in the blood, and they will capture and be excreted with interferons which are produced naturally or which we are using therapeutically, and we suddenly find that therapeutic interferons are ineffective. And if in fact we find that in a large number of virus infections and in a large number of different types of cancers, as shown in this slide, we have huge amounts of circulating alpha-beta interferon receptors appearing in blood, which then offset the interferon protective mechanism. Next slide. Now, this is a slide which is so new that I didn't have a chance to let the artists draw it yet. He's working on it now, so these are just my sketches. But basically what we have found that when a patient is infected with AIDS, he very rapidly develops high levels of AIDS and then slowly develops some antibodies against it, and then the virus level goes down. It becomes very, very low, and there is a so-called latent period. But then after a certain amount of time, which can be anywhere from weeks and very rarely years, the virus suddenly reappears again. At that time, some of the antibodies have already weakened, although they have not completely disappeared. But we find that that is the time when interferon inhibitors, as shown in the previous slides, appear and offset the protective effect of the interferon. Next slide. So we were thinking about what could we do about it. And we teamed up with some of our chemists at our university chemistry department and came up with a large number of compounds which we tested, and finally selected one out, which is a thiolated double-stranded RNA, which turned out to be a terrific interferon-inducing agent. Next slide. We, in fact, find that this agent produces tremendous increase in alpha, beta, and gamma interferons, and thereby for increases or interferon defense, even though the viruses induce inhibition to the interferon defensive system. We also find that this compound has many other activities, including it inhibits reverse transcriptase, which is an important mechanism for viruses to causing or cells to reproduce them. And of course, reverse transcriptase plays a very important role in AIDS, and it appeared to have many other effects. And in fact, we find in vitro that when we take blood from an AIDS patient whose disease appears to be resistant to all existing anti-AIDS drugs, in vitro we can still kill these cells by using these compounds.